Okay, in this lesson we're going to learn about cutting a screw thread. Now screw threads come in two different types. We have an external screw thread where the thread is on the outside of something, and we can have an internal screw thread where the thread is on the inside of something, so the two items can actually screw together. So what we're going to be looking to do today is to learn all the techniques for cutting the two screw threads. So the first one that we're going to do is looking at the internal screw thread, so the inside here. Now the device we're going to use for doing that is what's called a tap, and this is a tap here. So what I'm going to look at doing is using the tap to cut a screw thread on the inside of this hole. Now the hole has been drilled with what's called a tapping drill, and it's a specific size. So the thread that I want to cut here is an M8 thread, stands for metric 8, and what I'm going to actually do is drill that slightly smaller. It's actually drilled at 6.8 millimeters in diameter, so the thread then cuts into the hole to create the M8 thread. Now taps come in different types. There are three different types. There is what's called the taper tap, there is the second cut, and then there is the plug tap. In the taper tap, what we actually have is the first 5 or 6 threads of the tap are actually not fully formed or flattened very slightly, and what that allows is it allows the tap to go into the hole much easier to get started when cutting a thread. The second cut has 2 or 3 of the threads not fully formed, and again just makes it a little easier to get into the hole. And then in the last one, the plug tap, where almost all, or maybe apart from the very first thread, are actually all cut perfectly. And this is the tap that you would use if you were actually threading what's called a blind hole. Now a blind hole is a hole which doesn't go all the way through an object, so it actually is drilled to a depth. And what that would allow is the tap to be cut in so that it reaches the bottom of the hole and the thread is all the way to the bottom. Where if we used the taper tap, obviously the thread would be about 10 millimeters from the bottom of the hole fully formed. So that's why we use a plug tap on a blind hole. So we are going to use our M8 tap. I've got a taper tap here, and I've got in what's called a tap wrench. So I'm putting my bit of metal into my vise, locking it in there nice and securely, and then I'm going to take my tap, put it in so that it is going in, trying to keep it horizontal so that it's vertical and it is not wobbling about too much, and I press down and I turn. Okay, so I'm looking to try and keep it horizontal like this, and I'm getting it so the tap is actually biting, cutting as it's going through, and then once I've got it so it starts to become a little bit too tight, I turn back to clear the thread, and then go back to my starting point, and then I turn on another half turn, and then back to where I was, half turn, and back, and I get into a little bit of a rhythm where what I'm actually doing is each time a half turn, go back to clear it, back, half turn, back to clear it, and go back, and I keep doing that, going down all the way through the hole in the bar that you're actually trying to thread. Now as this hole is all the way through the bar, I can actually just continue all the way through with the taper tap. Now it will get to a point where I'll start to feel it loosening off, and that actually means that the tap is all the way through the hole. So at that point I can stop doing the backwards cut, and I can just keep it going, so I can feel there, I can just keep it going all the way through. I know the thread's cut all the way through it, so I then rotate it back off. Just as I'm rotating it off the end of this, I just be careful, so I'm pulling it and turning it at the same time so that I don't damage the last thread as I bring it out. The tap doesn't wobble over and damage it. So what I've then got is a screw thread cut all the way through both sides, and if I take something where I've got an external thread and I try the two of them together, it threads nicely into that. So So what you need to remember here is that we have got taps and we've got tap wrenches. The hole that's drilled in our metal is smaller than the size of the tap, so in this case I was doing an M8 thread, which means an 8mm thread. This one was drilled with a 6.8mm drill, and then we've threaded through it. There are 3 different types of tap. There is the taper tap, where there's 5 or 6 of the threads not fully formed, that helps us get started. We've got the second cut, and then we've got the plug tap, which is what you'd use for the blind hole. So once we have cut the thread, an internal thread, we're going to move on to cutting an external thread the same as this. So we're going to be cutting an external thread on here so that it can actually fit into there. So we're going to cut an M8 thread, so we're going to be using an M8 bar. So I put my bit of bar into my vise, and a couple of things I've got to do to help create a better thread and also to help me get started. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a flat file and I'm going to cut a little bit of a chamfer on the edge of this. So I'm taking the corner off of the top of the bar. And that is just going to help me get started. So, with the internal thread, it was a tap. With an external thread, we're going to use what's called a die. And a die is a circular device with a hole down through it, and the internal of that hole has got a thread. Now, a die and also the tap are made of what's called high-speed steel. It's a very hard steel. It's got to be hard because this material is going to cut another bit of metal. So the hardness of this is going to allow me to cut that thread. So when we're using the die, we also need a die holder to actually hold the die so that we can actually do that. Now we've got to get it the right way up in the holder. The die has got some writing to tell you what thread it is. It says here it's an M8 thread. It also tells me the pitch, the distance between each of the threads is 1.25. The other side doesn't have any writing on it. So when I put the die into the die holder, I have the writing uppermost and I put it in like so. Okay, and it goes all the way in. Now what we also have on the die here is some different screws, where what we can actually do is we can squeeze the die, because it's what's called a split die, and we can make it cut either a tighter thread or a looser thread, depending on what you're looking for. So we can over tighten these or whatever. So here's one that I've got earlier, where it's got the writing to the uppermost, and it is nicely held within there. So we've got our chamfer cut on here, and we're going to be starting to cut our thread on here. Now to ensure that we get a really good thread, really well cut, we're going to use a little bit of lubrication, which will help with the cutting of the thread, and we've got some what's called cutting compound here, and all I'm going to do is take a little of the cutting compound, put it onto the bar, put it back into the vise, have it vertically, nice tight, take my die and I'm pushing it down so the writing is facing downwards. So I start here, pressing down with my thumbs, and I start by pushing down and turning at the same time. And I'm looking to try and get the die to bite onto the metal. Okay, so I keep doing that, keep rotating it round until I start to feel it starting to get quite tight. At that point I'll just bring it back to clear the thread, same as we did with the tap, and then I'll keep going a little bit further, and then go back and clear it again, and that's me now got the die starting to cut. So I'm going to use the same technique, half turn to create a thread, go back to clear the thread. So half turn to cut, when it starts to get too tight, we go back, loosen it off, go back to where you were, half turn forward, back, and I get into a little rhythm of just doing that, and it will start to cut a thread all the way down. Now, when we do this for the hammer in design and manufacturing, manufacturer. We're looking for one end to be threaded 25mm, and we're looking for the other end to be threaded 15mm for them through the head. How do we actually determine how far we're going? Well, you can put a little bit of tape around the bit of bar, 15mm from the end, or you can use a marking pen to mark off 15mm from the end. For this demonstration, I'm just going to about there, and then I'll loosen back off, again taking care that I don't damage the thread, and take off all the little cuttings, and there you can see I have got a thread formed nice and clearly, which I can then screw in to my bar. So what I've got here is I've cut an internal thread with the tap, and I've cut an external thread with a die. What you're now going to do is you're going to answer some questions based on the little video that I've shown you, and then you will submit the answers back to me using Teams.